As a practical matter, how do you take this into account? How do you design policies in the White House that say, well, I recognize our limitations. I recognize the fact that we won't be able to get everything right, and there will be unforeseen consequences. What did you do? Give me some general ideas of how policymakers can learn from that aspect. It's not just a criticism of policy, but it's actually something that they can take away and learn from.
I'll give you an example, probably the most important example of something I worked on when I was there, and that was during the financial crisis. So we all remember the financial crisis that sort of peaked in fall of 2008. And we were very concerned about the financial firms failing. And if you look at the history of financial crises around the world, we know that if the financial industry fails, it tends to create long and deep recessions. And so that was the obvious concern. The question is, what do you do about that? That's one thing to have a concern, it's another thing to figure out what to do about it. So one of the policies that we considered was, if you may recall, it was called the TARP, Standard for Troubled Asset Relief Program. And what the TARP was about was trying to figure out, take some government money and then use that to somehow make the financial system better or more able to withstand the shock. And the question is, what do you do? And there were a variety of different ideas on this, all right? But in talking through that, my particular view, and I'd say the people who, thought the most like economists, were most concerned about having the government get too involved in the firms that they were actually trying to save. And so one of the things that we discussed was, if we give these guys money, how much control do we want to have over them? And not to be too political here, but one of the big differences between the Bush administration and the Obama administration is that we didn't want control over the firms. The Obama administration actually did want control over the firms. And we didn't want it because it kind of goes back to your original point on this, which is that we were just worried that we could not think through all of the unintended consequences of our actions, and that if we were to micromanage, if the government were to get in and micromanage these firms, we'd actually end up botching more things than we ended up helping. So the policy that we ended up going with was one of essentially buying preferred stock, non-voting preferred stock, so that the government would not have, the taxpayers, the government would actually not have a say in what those firms are doing. And you might say, well, why not? You're using government money, you're using taxpayer money, why shouldn't the government have a say? And the basic reason is because our view was that the firms have the right incentives to survive, and if they survive and maximize their own profits, the taxpayer will do better by allowing them to do it than to have us get in and telling them how to do it. We just didn't think we had the expertise. I think we were right on that. The evidence is that the TARP was a very successful program. It actually ended up being more than fully repaid. But that's not the test. I mean, the fact that the government makes money on something when it goes into the private sector is not the test of whether it's a good government policy. I think that the real test was that this was a horrible crisis, and we basically got through it reasonably well. And while we had a bad recession, the economy survived, and Wall Street doesn't look a whole lot different now than it did before the financial crisis, which is actually good news because that was one of the better functioning institutions that we have in the world.
So again, a recognition that you probably weren't the best decision maker when it came to how to actually run the companies. You might have played an important role in financial support for those companies and making sure they don't fail and induce the costs of that failure on the economy. But again, the recognition of limitations was really critical to that.
Yeah, I mean, another example, just on this recognition of limitations, just triggered a thought, which is if you think about the auto bailout, which was, very controversial, should go, especially for a Republican administration, market-oriented administration. Certainly myself, Vice President Cheney, and actually President Bush were, market-oriented guys. The last thing they wanted to do was go in and bail out the auto industry. And the question is, why do you do something like that? And what limitations you place. And the issue there is, okay, we know that the auto industry is in trouble, and a large part of it is because of things that went wrong in the past. Wage negotiations that got way out of control. These guys were compensating their workers at levels that were way above what other competitive firms were doing. If you compared, say, Toyota to GM, that comparison just jumped out at you that was not going to be a long-run equilibrium. So we had goals, but the problem was, how do you tell these guys? Do you go in and you actually tell GM how to run their business? Well, I don't think so. I mean, the fact that GM was failing doesn't change the fact that they were still the second largest automaker in the world. When people say no one's buying their cars, you kind of say, well, what are you talking about? They're the second largest automaker in the world. So we were reluctant to go in and again run that firm, but we did understand that that didn't mean that these guys make perfect decisions, and that didn't mean that they make decisions that are always in the public interest. And so, keeping that in mind, what we actually ended up doing was, when the auto bailout, when President Bush did decide to bail out the auto industry, what he did was he specified, okay, this is going to be a bridge loan, and in order to renew the bridge loan, we want you guys to either comply with these 3 conditions, which were kind of higher level goals, or if not, tell us why you're not, and make sure that you can make a case that justifies renewing your bridge loan. And that was kind of an in-between way to go, where you thought about some of the conflicts, but didn't exactly tell them how to do it. Basically said, here's where you got to get, but we're going to allow you guys to figure out how to get there.